Hey there, and welcome to Rob's Custom Wood Shop. My name's Rob, and today I'm going to be building this small bathroom cabinet using beginner woodworking techniques with the aim of helping beginner woodworkers with all the tips and tricks I know. For this build, all you need is a half a sheet of 3/4 inch plywood, a quarter sheet of 1/2 inch, and a quarter sheet of 1/4 inch, and a half of 1x6. For this build, I'm going to go back to basics. I'm simply going to use an edge guide, a regular skill saw, a table saw, and a handful of other basic tools. So an easy way to figure out where your saw blade is going to cut is simply to measure your saw from the surface you're going to be running against to the blade. In my case, I always use the outside, and from the outside to the blade on my saw is 1 7/16 inches, and to the inside is 1.5 inches. And just so I never forget these measurements, I mark on my saw my inside measurement and my outside measurement. When I break down my sheet goods, I always leave my pieces about 1 inch longer than the final dimension. This way, when I go to the table saw, I can use my miter gauge or crosscut sled to square up the pieces and remove the factory edge. Now I have a 60-tooth blade on my skill saw, but just as added protection to prevent tear out, I'm also going to put some painter's tape along my cut. Another tip to remember to help prevent kickback is to only have your blade protrude through your wood about 1/8 of an inch. The painter's tape was a precaution for me as well. This is the first time I've ever used this saw, and I wasn't sure exactly how it would work. After cutting the pieces to rough length, I then used the table saw to cut all my pieces to rough width. At this point, I use green painter's tape to mark each piece so I don't get confused as I'm cutting them. Now that all the pieces are cut to rough width, I use the table saw to cut about 1/4 inch off one side, and then I flip each piece over and cut it to final width. Now normally, to cut my pieces to final length and keep them square, I would use my crosscut sled. But for the sake of this video, what I'm going to use is the miter gauge that came with my table saw. To help give my miter gauge a little more support, all I have done to it is add a straight piece of 2x4 about 20 inches long. Now it's a good idea to square up the miter gauge before the first time you use it. Sometimes it tends to get bumped when it's being stored. Now since I know my miter slots are parallel to my blade, all I have to do is make sure the fence is square to the miter slot, and I know I'll be producing perfectly square pieces. I first cut 1/4 inch off one end to make it square. To help keep things square using this method, instead of rotating my piece to cut it to length, what I'm going to do is reference off the same edge by flipping it, and then both ends should come out parallel to one another. And since I have 3 pieces to cut exactly the same length, I'm going to stack them together and cut them all at the same time. I also cut the dividers and the top and bottom using the same method. Next, I took the time to lay out and mark where I want my pocket hole locations so they won't be visible in the finished product. And then I went ahead and drilled all my pocket holes. So with all the pocket holes done, now is the perfect time to drill my holes for my adjustable shelves. So for that, I'm going to use my Kreg jig. If you don't have this jig and you want your shelf to be fixed, you could always use pocket holes or screws from the side. Now I start assembling the carcass. I use these 90-degree clamping squares to help hold everything in place, and then I use glue and pocket hole screws to secure it. Now I don't know about you, but I have never bought a piece of plywood that was perfectly flat, so I ended up using another clamp to help pull everything into square. And then I just repeated the process for the second side. Now to install the top, I laid the whole cabinet into some pipe clamps and then secured it with pocket hole screws. Now since the bottom is not going to be seen, I just pre-drilled and screwed it to the cabinet. Now I didn't mention it before, but when I cut my pieces to rough width, I left my drawer faces at 4 inches deliberate. That was so I could use them as spacers to install my dividers. Next, using some 1x material, I'll cut some 1/8 inch strips for edge banding. Before doing this, please make sure you have a zero clearance insert plate so the pieces don't fall down beside the blade and kick back. While I was cutting thin strips, I also cut a 1/4 inch strip to edge band the top and the bottom. I only use glue when I install edge banding, and I use painter's tape to secure the piece in place while the glue cures. So right now, I'm edge banding all the exposed edges of the plywood that will be seen in the final product, including the face for the adjustable shelf. Next, I cut out my drawer pieces from a piece of 1/2 inch birch. Stacking the pieces 4 high, I cut one edge straight, and then using a stop block, I cut each piece to length. So for anybody who doesn't have the big pocket hole jig, here I'm using my Miles Craft pocket hole jig, which is equivalent to the RF3. So right now, I'm learning a lot. This is the first time in my life I've ever made drawers using pocket holes, and it was a learning experience. Spoiler, that was the second set of drawers. Now, out of a 1/4 inch piece of plywood, I cut the bottoms for the drawers, first to length and then to width. Before installing the drawer bottoms, I give them a thorough sanding. And then, just using glue and some 5/8 brads, I attach the bottoms. It was a bit of a tight quarters to get the drawer hardware attached, but with a little bit of finagling and a hand screwdriver, I got it in. Now that I'm attaching the drawer slides to the bottom of the drawer, you may notice a 2-inch overhang. Don't worry, I'll explain. With these drawer slides, they typically leave about 1/3 to 1/4 of the drawer inset. In my case, 2 inches. But if I were to use the full drawer slide, it would have been over 4 inches. So to counteract, I just made the drawers 2 inches smaller. So now I take the measurements for the drawer fronts. Taking into account, I'm going to be putting edge banding around them, trimming them to width and then to length using the table saw. Next, I trim down some 1x material to make the stiles and the rails of my doors. I really wanted to try making my doors using pocket holes, but after 2 attempts, I gave up and decided to make shaker style doors, which in my opinion really is the easiest way to make doors. Now since I'm using 3/4 inch material, I set my fence to 1/4 inch and then run the piece through. Then I flip the piece around and run it through again to give me an exact 1/4 inch groove in the middle of my piece. Then I readjust the fence and nibble out the little piece in the center. Next, using a combination of my fence and my miter gauge, I start to cut the tenons for my rails, just making many passes, 1 kerf width at a time. I check my fit, readjust my blade, do the whole process again, slowly sneaking up on the perfect fit. Once I get that fit, I cut the other 3 tenons. Cutting the panel for the door, I first cut it to width, then I cut one edge to make it square, and then I cut it to length. Before assembling the door, I give all the pieces a thorough sanding. I assemble the door just using glue on the end of each tenon and leaving the panel floating in the middle. I then put the door into the clamps and apply enough pressure to close the gaps between the stiles and the rails. Then using a tape measure, I check it for square and set it off to the side to cure. And since I'm in a gluing mood, I edge band my drawer fronts. Once the glue is cured and out of clamps, I then take and mark out the mortises for my hinges. Now I could use a router to cut these mortises, but I'm going to use this opportunity to practice carving with a chisel. I first go around the outline to cut the veneer, and then I carve away the inside of the mortise using the chisel. Once I reach the desired depth, I repeat the process on the other end of the cabinet. Then I carve out the mortises on the cabinet door. Then I install the hinges using a square on the edge of the hinge to keep them aligned. Once I have the door installed, I close it and check for the fit to make sure the gap is proper. To finish up this cabinet, I make the feet by first cutting a 30-degree bevel on both sides of a 1x, and then I use the miter saw and cut a 30-degree bevel on two other sides, leaving me with some neat looking feet. I attach them to the cabinet using glue and some brads, and then I sanded the whole cabinet to 180 to prep it for paint. For this build, I did 2 coats of primer and then 3 coats of paint. Once that was dry, I installed the drawer fronts to the boxes and then installed the knobs. And there we have the finished product. All in all, this was a fun build, and I can honestly say I learned a few things along the way. But make sure to tune into my next build, where I build a cabinet slightly larger than this one with more advanced joinery and maybe not so blue. Do you have any questions, tips, tricks, or suggestions? Please leave me a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to follow me on Facebook at Rob's Custom Woodshop. If you enjoyed this video, please hammer that thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more of my videos, don't forget to subscribe and ring that little notification bell so you never miss when I upload new content. Thanks for watching and hope to see you on the next project.